In the spirit of Global Diversity Awareness Month, we welcome our special guest, Chief Commissioner Manny Jules of the First Nations Tax Commission. Welcome, Manny.
Good morning, Nicole. It's a pleasure to speak to people I can't see. Usually I speak before an audience, so this is quite interesting. But I hope everyone's safe. I hope all of your families are safe, and we'll eventually get through this period of hardship.
Oh, well, thank you, Manny. We're very excited to have you here today, and I can tell you you've got almost 2,000 listeners right across the province of Ontario. So everyone's been looking forward to this special VLC with you. So welcome. And all of you, be prepared to be moved as you listen to Manny, because he's going to bring to light for us Indigenous issues within our own country and remind us of the importance of the work that MPAC does in property assessment. I'm now going to ask Chris Fusco, Director of Real Estate and Strategic Accounts on the Business Development team. He's also joining us today to come on the screen. Hi, Chris.
Hey, Nicole. Thanks for having me. Welcome, Manny. One of my long-term goals was to get you to one day address all of our staff, so I'm happy you're here. We got a slide to pop up. Just talk briefly about the work we're doing in Ontario. So MPAC right now, we've been working with First Nations, believe it or not, since 2001, when we did a lease renewal for Georgina Island. And we've had a close relationship with the First Nations Tax Commission since mid-2000s, and I've had the pleasure of knowing Manny since that time. So we've got 3 First Nations in Ontario right now who have implemented a property taxation system. The first was Kettle and Stony Point down in southwestern Ontario in 2016. And then Wasagasing First Nation and the Chippewas of Georgina Island came on board in 2018. Now, for many of you who've worked on these projects, the first year of implementation is the biggest lift. Not only are we dealing with the data collection, because we don't have this data on file, the valuation, but the communications, but not only with the First Nations and the leaseholders, the communication strategy is vital to the success of it. And we've had the support from the Tax Commission all along to work through the communications plan, and we're always bouncing everything off each other. So all 3 First Nations were successfully launched, and they're similar that they all have leaseholders, but they have very different circumstances on each First Nation. But they've all been able to collect property taxes and enhance their fire protection service, garbage collection. Roads are a big issue, especially up in Wasagasing. So again, like I said, I've had the pleasure of knowing Manny for many years. You're gonna probably never meet a person who understands how important property tax system, the role it plays in society, and I'm sure he's going to make us all feel pretty proud of what we do. Back to you, Nicole.
Okay. No, that's great. Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad you're able to check that off. You wanted Manny to address our whole staff, so you've achieved that.
One of the things on my list.
Excellent. Now, Chris is going to stay on in the background. So if you have questions throughout this VLC, Chris is going to come on and answer them through the chat function. So thank you, Chris. I'm now going to ask Brian Gordon, Regional Manager of Municipal and Stakeholder Relations, who's also on the Diversity and Inclusion Project team, to come on camera and talk a little bit about why you wanted to be on this VLC and why Manny was inspirational to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Nicole, and welcome, Manny. So first off, I truly feel fortunate and blessed to be a member of the Diversity and Inclusion team, as they are an amazing group of individuals who are really passionate about this new initiative and to see its success. And I'd like to quickly just give some kudos to Hanan, Miru, and Casey for shepherding us through this procurement process, which is new for some of us on the team. But most importantly, I look forward to really hearing this great discussion that and what Manny brings to the Indigenous community, and really just to hear more about his journey. And learning about Manny and what he's done has, for me, been quite inspiring. And often we wanna be a part of change. We wanna invoke change, and there are times we feel helpless or overwhelmed. And I think Manny's journey is truly inspirational, as it demonstrates that we can make change either collectively or individually. And so I really like to say, Manny, that you've done amazing work and for your community, but also that the work that you've done has resonated with other communities, other individuals. And so just really a great thank you for what you've done. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Brian. That
Appreciate
was
it.
really well said.
Thank you.
So Manny, how about you start by telling us where you're located right now? Because I know you're at a former residential school. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's we used to call it as a kid, KIRS, the Kamloops Indian Residential School. It was built in the 1890s at the request of Chief Louis, so that we would have our own school on the reserve. But it turned into one of the largest residential schools in Canada at its peak, housing about 600 Indian students from around the interior of British Columbia. A lot of different tribes. It's a Roman Catholic school. So what happened early on here in the province of British Columbia, and I'm sure right across the country, is all of the churches seemed to have gotten together and carved up who was going to save which souls. And it turned out for us here in Shuswap country, it was the Catholics. They started coming in about the 1850s, built a small church, and ultimately the government built a residential school here in the 1890s. Some of it burnt down. And the history is quite interesting. There was a program by Trudeau the Elder, Pierre Trudeau, to tear down residential schools. I believe there's upwards of 20 right across the country now. But we, as a council, chose to preserve this school because we didn't want to forget the good and the bad. And I learned a long time ago that education can either be a tool or a weapon. And we've chosen to preserve this as a monument, not only to the former residential school survivors and those that are still alive today, but also to remind all of us how important education is, but to use it as a tool as opposed to a weapon to take away language, history, and culture.
Wow, that's really powerful, using it as a tool rather than a weapon. So Manny, as you know, it's Global Diversity Awareness Month. Can you tell us a little bit about the current Indian Act and what your take is, especially with respect to diversity and inclusion? Because I think we could all benefit from this history.
Well, when I was first elected, believe it or not, I was elected to council 46 years ago. I'm 68 now. I just turned 68. I grew up with my dad being the chief of the Kamloops Indian Band, and he inspired me to run for council first and then as chief because he was chief for a decade. But I always like to comment that it was my mother who ensured I was elected. My dad inspired me, but my mom was the best campaigner I ever had. And the thing about the Indian Reserves and the Indian Act, in 1974, when I was first elected, the NDP government here in British Columbia amalgamated 18,000 acres of our reserve to include it as part of the city of Kamloops. And the council just before my election protested this and basically told Dave Barrett in the NDP government, who was saying at the time that it was just an imaginary line. And we were telling him that, well, we're not imaginary Indians. And what it was at the time was a tax grab on the part of the provincial government to turn over the real property taxes from the provincial government coffers to the municipal government. And so by 1975, we closed by occupying the Department of Indian Affairs here locally. And it was at that time that I realized that even though we had shut down the Department of Indian Affairs, they simply moved from Kamloops to Vancouver and to Ottawa because they were basically legislated. The Indian Act itself is one of the 5 oldest pieces of Canadian legislation. It's been with us since 1867 when Canada became a country. And I tell people today that you need look no further than the Indian Act to realize there's a systemic racism in the country. Because of the Indian Act, we don't own our own lands. The federal government has title to our lands. We were asking the federal government and have asked continuously that our rights to our lands be recognized by the federal government. And this could be easily done by simply passing a piece of legislation, recognizing our title and rights to, at the very minimum, the Indian reserves we've got across the country. So the Indian reserves simply means a tract of lands whose title is vested in Her Majesty. And because of that, you've got the outstanding question of housing on reserves, potable water, sewer systems and the like are all rooted in the fact that we don't have title. And so when you consider just simply the housing issue, if you believe the Department of Indian Affairs, it'll take us 300 years to catch up to the housing backlog on reserves right now. If you believe the Assembly of First Nations, it'll take us 800 years to catch up to the housing backlog. I served as an advisor to 2 Auditor Generals, and during that time we undertook a number of studies looking at housing on reserves. In essence, what we're doing is we're building disposable homes. Within the first 5 to 7 years, most homes on reserve require major renovations. And that's simply because those homes really don't belong to us. They belong to Her Majesty. And the House, as you know, even though there's been a boom during COVID-19 here with the tiny condos being one of those that are impacted, particularly in Toronto, is a true marker of the Canadian economy. And on reserves, because of the lack of housing, that's had a major impact on our economy. As a matter of fact, the infrastructure or the fiscal deficit that we've got is in billions of dollars. The credit gap that we've got is somewhere in the range of $175 billion. And that's because we can't utilize nor access bonding to get into small business. It's affected a lot of small business owners. We can't use our homes for collateral. And so you can't even build a home on your own. You have to depend completely on the Department of Indian Affairs. And this COVID-19 has really exposed the plight of First Nations right across the country. And not only us, but it seems like all people of the lower echelons of the economy have been impacted more so than anybody else. And right now, during the second wave of COVID, we're starting to see an uptick in COVID on reserves. And because of the situation of overcrowded housing on reserves, it's a big fear that this would have a severe impact in our communities. And so when you think about really the situation of First Nations, what COVID has really demonstrated to me, and right from, we were shut down in early March, I started to reflect on the teachings of what I call my elder leaders, Chief Louis and Johnny Chalhitsa, right around 1910, when they were making presentations to Sir Wilfrid Laurier and to Oliver, who was the Minister of the Interior and therefore the minister responsible for Indian Affairs at that time. They were asking for title to our own lands. They were asking for doctors. They were asking for proper education. And all of these things really was the impact of the smallpox epidemic on First Nations, particularly here in the province of British Columbia. dating to 1862, 1863. And that informed them. They were elder leaders at that time in 1910. As a matter of fact, Chief Louis died within 6 years, just 2 years before the Spanish flu influenza of 1918. And so these elder leaders were asking for the government that we be in a position to be able to look after ourselves through another pandemic. They knew that another pandemic would happen sooner or later because of their experience coming through not only smallpox, but measles and a myriad of other, introduced diseases into British Columbia. As a matter of fact, the smallpox epidemic led to the settlement and colonization of the province of British Columbia because it decimated 3/4 of the First Nations population here. It made it easy for the federal and provincial governments to have their colonial, approach take place and take root here in BC because we weren't in a former position as being able to fully take care of ourselves. And so COVID-19 has exposed that. And what I found striking is that we're asking for the same thing again. We're asking for a fair and just settlement to the land question. We're asking for greater tax jurisdiction so that we can have the same fiscal powers as the federal and provincial governments. And it's those who have tax powers or fiscal powers that now have a credit rating. When you look at First Nations and the economy, our economies that have been decimated as a result of colonization, all of these things have to be changed, but how do you begin to do that? And so when those early teachings of my father, who was in turn taught by his elders, his father was on council here in Kamloops for over 30 years, has informed my belief that right is might. And that one day the federal and provincial governments, with the support of ordinary Canadians, will change the plight of First Nations and ensure that we're not only a fundamental part of the economy, but we're a fundamental part of the family through the Canadian Constitution.
We got a question here, Manny. Sorry to interrupt. I think it's a good one too, given it's Global Diversity Awareness Month. But one of the questions was about the picture on the slide that's up on the screen right now about Tweety.
Yes.
And I think it's the question is your thoughts on the comments from that MP. It's a true demonstration of racism. But what are your thoughts on it and reasonings behind the importance of that slide?
Well, I think everybody can see it, but I'll read it. While the Indian may be satisfied or he may not, my personal view with regard to the Indian is that he is a ward of the government, and being a ward, he is bound to accept the treatment given him. And the treatment that was given our people at the time was basically throwing us to the wolves. And, when I think about his statement, that point of view was so entrenched in the government. As a matter of fact, it took until 1958 for the Diefenbaker government to even recognize First Nations in this country as citizens of Canada. Up until that point, we were not only landless, but we were without being recognized as part of the Canadian system or even have the right to vote. And it wasn't until 1967 that the Quebec government, it was the last province to allow First Nations to vote in provincial elections. Our voting took in British Columbia here, started to take place in 1949, right after the Second World War. And that's really, I have to pay homage to the veterans who fought not only in the First and Second World War, we're coming up to Remembrance Day soon. If it wasn't for those individuals putting their lives on the line for not only the recognition of First Nations, but also acknowledging the diversity that Canada has, because they went and fought the countries that were trying to oppress free will. there was a real change in the body politic here in Canada. It meant that those veterans coming back wanted to be treated like every other Canadian. That every other, situation that they realized that we were somehow treated differently. And that led to major political changes. It also led to the fact that we could vote, but in turn, it led to the Trudeau government later on challenging our land and title rights to acknowledge that there were outstanding issues related to the land and they should be dealt with. And then in turn led to struggles to have our recognition in the 1980s through a constitutional recognition, which of course failed. So diversity is incredibly important. And, the reason that we're able to get the vote and get changes is because of the diverse support that ordinary Canadians have given, not only to their local members of parliament, but their local legislative assembly members, making sure that these issues aren't forgotten about. And that's where I believe impact is critically important, because you help bridge that gap between the lack of fiscal powers and the realization that we have ultimately real property tax powers, which of course have to be handled in a manner that's respectful to all of our citizens and those that it impacts, and it has to be impartial. When you have the ability to be able to create a debt and say you pay it, that's an awful lot of power, and it has to be handled with transparency and accountability.
No, thank you, Manny. And you can be our spokesperson, because you said that so eloquently about our role. And Chris, I'm glad you came back up on the screen, because Manny, the first time I was able to hear you speak, Chris had invited you into a team meeting, and it was really eye-opening what you have been advocating for with, you mentioned a few moments ago that the pride of home ownership. If you don't own your property, as you say, like they require major renovations. And this is something that we take for granted. We have pride of home ownership, and we use our homes as leverage to borrow, and whether it be for our businesses or for our families or for our retirement, and that's not something that you're afforded. And so MPAC coming in, and I think it was Kettle and Stony Point was our first opportunity to really start to help some of these communities be sustainable. So maybe Chris and Manny, you can talk about just the importance of the work that we're doing and how it's going to help communities.
And just to add to that, we had a question come through Matt Stubbs about the land title system, Manny, and as Nicole has one of her questions as well, like, the first time we sat down together for lunch in Toronto, you asked me if I'd ever been on a reserve, and explained to me that, on a First Nation, you can't go to the bank and get a mortgage. And perhaps you could chat a little bit about that and the role of perhaps land titles and property taxation might help us and assist in changing that in the future.
Well, it's an interesting history. It's really what Canada is really based on is an extractive economy. And what happened and what that means is that Canada could not access the resources without first placing us on Indian reserves. And once the federal and provincial governments were able to do that, and indeed the territorial governments as well, they could exploit the resources off of the reserves. And once we were placed on reserves, as Tweedy had said, we became completely dependent on the federal government. And it was through a succession of amendments to the Indian Act leading up to 1927, when it took away all of our powers over self-tax. There's a lot of resistance in First Nations communities about taxation. And a lot of it is because of various amendments that took place taking away that jurisdiction from us. We not only had tax jurisdiction over ourselves, but over our traditional territories. It meant that we were able to share in the bounty of the land and the resources. And so when you apply those same principles to individual land holdings on reserve, of course, we have what's called certificates of possession. But certificates of possession simply mean that. You have a right of possession. You don't have ownership over those lands. Those lands are still held by Her Majesty. You know, Lizzie, I don't think recognizes she owns so much Indian reserves in Canada. And one of the other things is that she also has reserves in New Zealand. So virtually everywhere where the British colonial system happened, you had the advent of reserves. And so here in Canada, it's because we don't have title to our own lands, then it becomes a question of federal liability over whether or not they would even be able to build homes. And so because of that, the federal government builds about 2,500 or 2,000 homes on an annual basis because the minister has to co-sign that loan in order to have a mortgage on a reserve. And the backstop to that, of course, is band councils. And so the largest amount of indebtedness on reserves is because of individuals not paying their mortgages on reserves. And it simply goes back to the fact that we don't have ownership of those properties. And with the federal government, it exposes their approach on dealing with First Nations. They look at First Nations as a liability, indeed the provincial governments as well. And so when you think about that, it not only has application on a house, because if you build a home, then there's liability over social access to social assistance, education, potable water, because you're now going to have to build a water system. You're now going to have to look at building a sewer system. You know, all of those questions become, you know, a point when you're negotiating with the federal government. That's why it takes so long to build infrastructure on reserves, because it goes back to the question of liability. And so when you consider right now the federal government saying, well, we're spending about $17 billion a year on First Nations, the majority of that is managing poverty. Some of it is other liabilities the federal government has got on their own, settling the land question, you know, whether it be specific claims to a particular community or the treaty processes or self-government. You know, I view those as federal liabilities. And so when you begin to hive away those expenditures, you're left with a very small percentage of money that actually goes to the reserves. And then because you have no ability to be able to lever those resources on your own, that means you can't just go to the bank. So every time I think about taxation, that's one jurisdiction where it gives you that bridge between your indebtedness, your ability to pay down debt, and your ability to build infrastructure and the like. And so that's what Canada is doing right now through COVID. We're probably going to reach $1 trillion of debt nationally here. And, you know, the hope, because there's a low amount to pay down the debt, you know, the Canadian and provincial governments are looking at that to take us through the COVID, you know, problems we've got right now, COVID-19, with all of the myriad of health issues that it brings. But again, you know, First Nations, we're not in a position to be able to do that ourselves. We had a meeting just last week with the Taiwanese representatives of the Taiwanese government. They donated 6,000 masks to our communities. And that was an incredible gift because we've been waiting in line like everyone else to make sure we had personal protection. We've had some, but that was quite a gift that the Taiwanese government gave us. And so when you think about the issues, and all of us are familiar with all of the myriad of issues that's plaguing this country right now, but COVID has exposed them. You know, and one of the sad things, even with healthcare, you had the young lady, 37, dying in the hospital, crying out and pleading for help. And there was no help there. She died, you know, and so there's lots of room for improvement, And the way that the way forward really is to ensure that we have the same kinds of fiscal powers as other governments take for granted. And we have to have the same kinds of institutions that support our economies that other Canadians take for granted. And as a matter of fact, don't realize that we don't have. And it's a direct result of the Indian Act. And so when I read the comments that Tweety made, they echo in the houses of, where a little while ago we were talking about the ghosts of the Kamloops residential school. Well, there are ghosts inherent in the Canadian Parliament. And those words are still echoing in the House of Commons right now, even though it's being restored, because of the tone, because of the systemic racism that it embodies, and the fact that First Nations have always been finding and providing the leadership in trying to find our way. But because of this question of liability and this question of who is responsible, what I constantly tell the federal and provincial governments, let us take on that liability. We know what kind of priorities we need within our communities, whether it be housing, whether it be elders facilities, whether it be, infrastructure that we require to be able to build an economy. And all Canadians will benefit from that. And so that's the reason that, again, institutions like yourselves are critically important, because you help bridge that gap that we've got economically. And you afford us an ability to be able to have credibility with those who are impacted with the jurisdiction, while on one hand ensuring that our jurisdiction will be implemented, but on the other hand ensuring that we're demonstrating through this partnership a way forward that's really at the fundamentals of what family is.
And we've been able to deliver on. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, that's okay. I was just going to say, Manny, our nearly 2,000 staff who are watching today, at least within Canada and Ontario, it's the largest form of revenue of a municipality is property taxes. And that affords all that sustainability. And municipalities know what they need, whether it be infrastructure and schools and community centers. And that's what property tax affords. And us as property owners, like that's our contribution. And we have that pride of home ownership.
Yes, yes.
And Manny, we've been able to deliver on our commitments. We're just in the process of teams are preparing assessment rolls and notices to go out to First Nations. But one question we had was, are you aware of any First Nations that have had any difficulties collecting the property taxes due to the COVID? Has there been any issues?
Yeah.
Or...
Every one of our communities has been impacted with the collection of real property taxes on reserves. Because it's, a little bit later in the year, we're looking at a substantial decrease in the amount of money that has been collected so far. And a lot of that is a direct result of, smaller corporations, having difficulty through this period of time. And one of the things we found early through COVID was that a lot of our First Nation governments weren't eligible, nor the members were eligible for a lot of the federal government rollouts and indeed the provincial government rollouts for funding. Of course, the provincial governments are saying, their programs don't apply on reserves. But with the federal government, as an example, we had asked early on for a tax relief program, but they didn't feel that it was national in scope enough. And so we're rolling it into another program that we're hoping that the federal government will view, with some sympathy, if you will. And so in some of the communities, as you are aware, because of the lack of health infrastructure on reserve, literally had to close their borders. and that affected their cottage industries. And because it affected their cottage industries, individuals weren't able to go to their cottages and therefore aren't going to be paying their property tax this year and indeed their leasehold incomes. And so it becomes a domino effect on reserves. We're hoping that the majority of our revenues will eventually be paid. Most of the communities are implementing their own tax deferral programs. We've been reaching out and working with a lot of the communities right across the country. So there's a very real and direct impact on our communities with real property tax. It generates about it seems pretty small, but it's pretty significant for a lot of the communities across the country. It's generated about 100 million on an annual basis. Since First Nations have been collecting property tax, it's generated in the range of $1 billion. And with the First Nations Finance Authority, we've been also able to lever another $1 billion from private enterprise on an international basis. And so all of this leads to the point that we need our own institutions. And one of the things we've been advocating through COVID is our own infrastructure institute. So that right now, as I was mentioning earlier, you have to negotiate with the federal government for literally a decade to build any infrastructure on reserves. We're saying if you're able to, through the federal government transfers to First Nations, we would be able to lever that on an international bond market and turn one water system into 100, turn one sewer system into a couple of hundred, one healthcare facility, as we're talking about here in British Columbia, into about 20. And so it means that if we can pool our resources in our jurisdiction, it means that our lands will become more productive. We'll be able to be more resilient to get through not only COVID, but ultimately, we don't know how long the second wave is going to be lasting. A vaccine, optimistically, people were saying maybe by the end of this year. I was hopeful, but I don't think that's going to be true. We all have to hope. But sometime next year, we'll definitely have a vaccine. But that isn't going to mean that the economy is going to open up right away. And so when you look at all of the stats, with what's happening in Toronto, those can be easily applied to First Nations. The losses, not only in terms of our real property tax, but the loss of revenues, the loss of businesses. Our tourism industry has basically been gutted. It's going to take a long time to rebuild our tourism industry. And here in British Columbia, it was a multi-million dollar industry. The amount of revenues that we were generating just off of real property taxes I was mentioning was 100 million. The federal and provincial governments collected 700 million off of those same properties. And so what we're asking the federal government is also a little bit of equalization in the amount of revenues they take from our lands yet.
Manny, there's a slide that you had a minute ago. I'm going to ask if we can put up the Chichen Itza pyramid there. Maybe you can just share a little bit about it as we're talking. The title of the slide is Built Without Federal Government Revenues. Maybe you can share your perspective.
I love history. History really informs us for the life that we're living now, and it also means that we're not going to, at least hopefully, not repeat the mistakes of the past. And so what you see in front of you is El Castillo, which is basically a pyramid that was built by the Mayans in about 900 AD and on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. And the Yucatan Peninsula was the first Indian rebellion in the New World that led to the formation of a state that was recognized internationally. And it was a short-lived, state, but indeed it ultimately was for a short period of time. And so if you look at this, you will recognize that if you don't, It was built by Indigenous people. It was built by our engineers, by our scientists. It was able to place, and correspond to the planting seasons in the spring and in the fall. So I happened to be there on September the 21st, which was my mom and dad's anniversary. But it also was when the serpent would come down El Castillo and signal that it was the beginning of the corn planting season. And the corn in Mesoamerica was critically important. That's where it was invented. It took 9,000 years for that wild plant to be able to be the maize and the corn that we've got today, one of the most important vegetables worldwide. That and the potato, it far exceeds its weight in gold, those contributions to humanity. And so when you think about the steps, it's the calendar, 265 steps leading up, and it ultimately adds up to 365 days of the year, all of the steps and all of the little other parts. Right on the very top is really the sweat lodge. And the sweat lodge is something that all of us are familiar with in Indigenous country. There's a myriad of sweat lodges everywhere you go. As a matter of fact, the federal government tried to ban First Nations religious activities through various pieces of legislation. But right when you go inside the sweat lodge, what I call the sweat lodge, it's the top of the temple, you would see the four colors demarking the four colors of the four directions, which we have here in Shuswap country. As a matter of fact, we have the same four colors of the four directions all over the Americas. And so that to me symbolized the relationship that we had with all Indigenous people throughout the Americas. And so that was incredible for me to witness. And at that moment in your life, you have various epiphany moments. And mine was looking at this saying, we built this without federal funds. It's incredible. We built this on our own. And that's why we need our own institutional development, so that we can have this kind of imagination, build structures that last for over 1,000 years, based on our own expertise, based on our own labor. And those is really what gives me the optimism for the future. Because when I think about the future, it isn't so much as the built heritage that we've got, but it's the kinds of contributions that First Nations can make ultimately to the world and its economy. But it isn't so much about what we can do, it's about what's between our ears. And it's going to be imagination. It's going to be, innovation, and the kinds of innovation that our people can continue to make in the future. Right now, there's about 75,000 potential students that could be in the sciences, that could be in technical programs like engineering, mathematics. All of those are fundamentals to building an economy. And it is indeed because of those scientists in the Mayan times that built this facility. They could track the heavens. They had a more accurate calendar that anyone else had at the time. They even had the concept of zero, which is phenomenal. They had their own alphabet. So to me, it's a symbol of resiliency and of inspiration, and of what we can achieve, what we have achieved, and what we could give to the world.
That's amazing. And I love that you added the word inspiration, because you had imagination, innovation, and inspiration. And I was fortunate enough years ago to visit Chichen Itza, and when you're there, you really do experience it. You look at the history and you see the innovation. And just before we went live, you were sharing being in the residential school that you attended, you can actually hear the voices of the children that you went to school with. So being in the presence of history is so important for all of us.
Oh, absolutely. It's I had the chance to visit a number of other sites in the Yucatan Peninsula during that trip. And, for me, it just really, I've had an interest in history ever since I've been little, still am little. But, history is so, history is so critically important. And unfortunately, the kinds of history that has been, when I was taught here at the Indian school, I learned about Western civilization. I learned about Plato. I learned about lots of other, developments from Greek mythology. And I remember one argument with one of the nuns about the fact that my ancestors wouldn't go to heaven because we were uncivilized, that we weren't baptized. And we had an argument, I was in grade 7, about that. I said, who are you to tell me that I won't be joining my ancestors when I die? My ancestors had our own way of living. We lived on this land. We made lots of contributions. And she was saying, well, because you weren't baptized at that time, they're not going to be going to heaven. And that sparked in me this thought about why did that even exist? And it was because of colonization that one of the popes, right after the Spanish were taking over the Caribbean and then Mexico, they asked, and the Portuguese, of course, came into play as well. They asked for a papal inquiry and led to a papal bull or a bulletin into whether or not Indigenous people of the Americas had a soul. And so the first thing that had to happen was for the Spanish, could they, did we have a soul? And if we had a soul, then we could be taken in a just war. And therefore our lands could be taken for King Ferdinand. And so, yes, we had a soul, and then our lands could be taken. And then our people were enslaved, and we were part of this global market for our lands and for our resources. And what we're asking for even today, during this COVID epidemic, is the recognition of our rights and our aspirations to be able to look after ourselves and therefore make the kinds of contributions that our people formerly did. And that's not to say that we still haven't. We've made many, many contributions. Lots of words that are part of the Canadian dialect right now are either from the Chinook language here in the Pacific Northwest, or like words like canoe, moccasin. They have our roots in native languages, and so it's an inspiration. It truly is, but it also gives us markers about what we need to overcome, and it also signals to us that those issues can be overcome, that we can, if we choose, get over it. And and again, the symbolism is not lost on me about Chichen Itza, but also the residential school here. That I'm opposed to tearing down these facilities, because we have to accept history for what it is, both the good and the bad. And when we learn history that way, we learn that we can never repeat it.
Absolutely.
Manny, we got
education.
10
Tool, not a
minutes
weapon. Sorry,
left.
Chris.
We got one good question. Sorry, one good question. We got time for one last question from the field, Nicole?
Let's do it.
I think it's a
Yes,
good one too. We've chatted about it before, Manny, and I've heard it seminars with First Nations with Andre from Tulo. And this question came from Jerome Rose in our Bracebridge office. Why do you think the First Nations have been so slow at adopting property assessment systems? I know in BC you have quite a few more, but in Ontario we've only got 3, and we've been talking to many of them for many years. So I've heard you answer this before, but I think it would be good for our staff to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, it goes right back to us being legislated out of an ability to be able to tax ourselves. And so that happened in 1927. There was a number of other pieces of legislation that banned the collecting of tax from ourselves. A lot of people talk about it in terms of those were the potlatch laws. Potlatches were winter dances held here in British Columbia, and they really were the basis on which you redistributed wealth amongst a community and others. And in Ontario, there were winter dances that led to the same thing. Well, anytime there was a basis on which Indigenous people could gather and make contributions to fight the land question, the fight for economic rights and those kind of things, the federal government said we have to take away those abilities for First Nations so that they can't raise money, they can't hire lawyers, and they can't, again, they become wards of the government. And so that's the root of why the take-up is slow, really, in the rest of the country. Here in British Columbia, a lot of our winter villages, that's primarily where reserves were established, like here in Kamloops, it was our winter village site. We were, the city of Kamloops grew up around us. And so therefore we were in an ideal situation. As a matter of fact, we resisted pleas from the city of Kamloops and the provincial government to relocate us away from our traditional lands. And so we ultimately won that argument, and we established an industrial park. And that was true throughout the province of British Columbia. We were in a position where we were adjacent to local municipalities and were able to continue on with trade, because that's how our societies and our cultures survived for many millennia, is that we could do this. And so in Ontario, what happened is that because, and it is funny because provincial governments could tax on reserve lands, not because of the Indian Act, but because of national parks. And so in 1949, there was a court case out of Alberta that allowed the provincial governments to collect not on the land, but in persona on Jasper and Banff. And that led to an ability to be able to collect tax in persona on Indian reserves. And so all of the provincial governments occupied the area of tax on Indian reserves. Not a lot of reserves outside of British Columbia and Ontario are adjacent to municipalities, so therefore it didn't have a big impact. But it did have a big impact here in BC. That's why I had to move to amending the Indian Act in 1988 to get real property tax jurisdiction off of reserve lands. In Ontario, what happened leading up to what is called the white paper policy, the Trudeau Senior policy of assimilation. He was going to do away with the Indian Act and just allow First Nations to be assimilated into the broader Canadian society, if you will, and that was resisted. And so one of the individuals in Ontario is a bureaucrat by the name of Itza, ultimately became an elected member of the Ontario Legislative Assembly and amended the Assessment Act. And that's all it took, was an amendment to the Assessment Act that allowed gave credence to the provincial government vacating the property tax field on reserves. And so in the meantime, from about 1972 to the present, most bands in Ontario have occupied what would be the real property tax room by collecting service fees for garbage collection, water, and the like. And then in the meantime, there was also the creation of this notion that we don't tax, which mystifies me, because here in British Columbia, we even have a Chinook word for it. It's TAKSIS. And so we acknowledge that power, we exercise that power. As a matter of fact, right across the country we did, but because we were banned from doing that from federal legislation, that seemed to somehow translate to individual First Nations having a resistance to taxation. And then when you've got this notion of Section 89 of the Indian Act, which forbids property tax from being assessed on individuals' properties, individuals have resisted this, First Nation governments getting into taxation without recognizing that that and alone has cost us about $775 billion from our access to capital. So it's got a long history, and it's one that we've worked quite hard to overcome. And as I mentioned, real property tax since 1991 has generated in excess of $1 billion, and is now $1 million or $100 million annually. And so the more we get Tulo involved with students, the more the students realize that taxation is a fundamental part of government, and indeed a fundamental part of the fiscal relationship that we've got to have, the more First Nation communities will come on board. It's going to take a little bit more time yet, but it will happen.
No, that's great. That was a great question, and I think we all appreciate that context and walk through history. So Manny, we're almost out of time. I want to ask you a final question. One thing that's really important to myself personally, and as well us here at MPAC, is we talk about mental health and wellness. And this year with the pandemic has been trying for all of us, and we all have different strategies. And I know a lot of people use journaling as a way to work through some of the mental health. And I know that you do something different called ledger art. Could you share a little bit about that for us?
When I'd asked, I was in Palo Alto at the Hoover Institute looking at ledger art on display, and I asked a friend of mine to see if you could find me a ledger book. And ledger art has its history with the Lakota people on the prairies of the United States, and they transitioned from using hides from their winter count. They would draw out one or two significant events from a year, and then it translated to, when they were asked questions, what happened at the Little Bighorn, as an example. So they would draw that on the only paper that was available, which was ledgers, which really was, kept track of, how much sugar was brought to the res and all of those other things. And so I got a piece of a book of ledgers from the 1860s, 1870s. And I started to draw on them to have my interpretation of ledger art. And that gave me my Zen moments, if you will. And I've completed about 110 pieces of ledger art, and decided to compile that into a book of my remembrance of this incredible year that we've all gone through. And, I was talking to one of the local chiefs here. He said that he's had more requests from young people to begin to help looking after their mental health. And so it's important for us not only to reestablish, the home environment, but who is important to us. And a lot of times we can't, like I haven't been able to hug my mom now for about 7 months, and that's caused all of us a high deal of stress. But we have to take these moments of Zen. We have to be able to reflect on who we are and what kind of contributions we can make for the greater good. And for me, doing my ledger art, and Nicole and Chris, you're going to be getting copies of the book soon. So I look forward. So that's my little story about my Zen moments.
That's great. So let's all of us after this find our Zen, because we need to continue to be resilient as we move forward. And Manny, I want to thank you so much. Brian said, you're an inspiration, and you are an inspiration, and you have so much energy, and just thank you for all the work that you do in advocating and keeping it, out there and talking about it and joining us here today to share your perspectives. I was thrilled that you're able to join us. I think we all learned a lot. I learned a lot, and we need to continue to have this dialogue and bring awareness to this. So thank you for everything that you do, and we wish you well, and hopefully we'll have you join us again soon.
Oh, I want to do this live one day.
Well, we'll keep you to that. Thank you, Manny. Thank you, Chris and Brian, for joining us and for co-hosting with me. That was really, really helpful. So thanks, everyone.
Pedro.
Bye, Manny.